Yeah, so we're gonna get started here. We got to about 10:30, so it's gonna be a short one, short but to the point. So again, in the link, you want to pull out the text, feel free. But I'm going to share my screen in a second too. Let's start with a blessing. I put it in the chat as well. It starts with Baruch, the whole thing. Bless you, our God, rule the universe, who commands us to busy ourselves with study of Torah. Busy ourselves, occupy ourselves. That's the blessing, which doesn't necessarily mean that we always 100% get everything 100%, It's about engaging in it. It's trying. That's what the blessing is. God wants us to try to learn Torah as best we can. That's the beautiful thing. And that's what you're here to do. I'm so proud of you already. All right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right. Amen. Amen. So let me share my screen here. And yes. Okay. Let's see if that is. Some of these other ones are going to distract my Facebook page and junk. Okay. Everyone can see, please. Is that good?
See if you can make it just a little bit larger.
Oh, Roberta.
Yeah. Some of us have old eyes.
I hear you. Okay, look, it's so funny. I've reached that place too. All right, let me.
If you can, great. Otherwise, I'll figure it out.
No, it's just a matter of how do I do this so I can see. Okay, 1 second. Let me see how do I do this? How do I make it bigger? Go bold. I'm used to doing this at home on my Mac. I'm a little less skilled on my PC, believe it or not. Give me 1 second. Oh, there's no one more person won't. Oh, I think, wait, here we go. How's this, Roberta? Better, everyone? All right. Mazel tov. There is a miracle. Okay. All right. Let me introduce like this. Purim and Passover. Purim's happening in about 2 weeks-ish, something like that. In fact, I'm making a note. I need to get my costume. People know I like to dress up for Purim. I gotta get my costume. All right. Purim about 2 weeks. Pesach, Passover happens about 1 month later. They're both spring-ish, definitely Pesach. Purim is like an early spring holiday in general. They come at a similar time of the year in the Jewish calendar, and they both have big differences and big similarities. Some of the similarities, I think most people don't pay attention to. So even though I know Robin was fired up about the verses, and we'll get into the verses, Purim versus Passover, and also how they both respond to injustice differently. I'm just gonna put out there, it's like there's some connection. Look, on the one hand, on Purim, the big food is, put in the chat, hamantashen. It's made of leaven. What food do you not eat on Pesach?
Leaven.
Leaven. So on the one hand, there's big differences, okay? And we can keep going down the road. But on the other hand, there's big similarities. On Purim, there's a people that wants to destroy us. On Pesach, there's a guy who wants to destroy us. So you can see that now what I want to do here is want to frame what is Purim similar and how is Purim different. And what I'm going to say is clearly how they're similar is they're both dealing with this situation where, and of course, Purim's story is a little more of a farce, a little more of a satire. That's a difference. But there is this underlying serious message of attack and the same thing. So this is how we're going to go into the here. The similarities and differences in the holidays, but definitely the similarities or differences in how they respond to injustice, mainly when there are injustices against the Jewish people. When we're being oppressed, attacked, how do we react? What do we learn? What is our strategy? And then the idea being that what do we want to bring forward is what we might learn for this very day. To this very day when, sadly, as we still do to this day, when there are enemies out there, or people, anti-Semites, whatever, who are trying to attack us, everything from, sadly, what happened in Texas recently to Pittsburgh relatively recently, or Poway, California, or situations that deal with where criticism of Israel turns into anti-Semitic attacks or anti-Semitic, and that's a whole conversation we can have, where things of against where legitimate criticism of all kinds of things, where people look for a scapegoat. This is our challenge. So let me just give you just Actually, you know what? Let's read out. I think a very profound. In fact, it's a sources class. A teacher of mine named Yossi Klein Halevi. Has anyone ever heard of Yossi Klein Halevi before? Yes. Okay. Probably Ellen study. Maybe heard this before. He wrote a passage, a column for a Jewish media like a couple of years ago, where he determined, in his view, the two fundamental messages of Purim and Pesach, and how they're similar and how they're different. And I cut it down to this little section that I'd like to see if someone would read out loud what he thinks are the two main messages of Purim and Pesach to start our conversation. And next, I'm going to ask you what you think is similar about Purim or different Purim and Pesach. Would someone be willing to read out what Yossi Klein Halevi says? Okay, Roberta, Toda Rabah.
Yossi Klein Halevi said, Jewish history speaks to our generation in the voice of two biblical commands to remember. The first voice commands us to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and the message of that command is, don't be brutal. The second voice commands us to remember how the tribe of Amalek attacked us without provocation while we were wandering in the desert, and the message of that command is, don't be naive. The first command is the voice of Passover, of liberation. The second is the voice of Purim, commemorating our victory over the genocidal threat of Haman, a descendant of Amalek. Passover Jews are motivated by empathy with the oppressed. Purim Jews are motivated by alertness to threat. Both are essential. One without the other creates an unbalanced Jewish personality, a distortion of Jewish history and values.
Thank you, Roberta. Okay. So what Yossi Klein Halevi puts out there, just to be clear, Amalek is this tribe, which we're going to maybe look at in a little bit. When we were wandering in the desert trying to make it to the promised land, some of you may know the story. What did they do to us? Who knows?
Remember? They attacked us.
They attacked us. How? Do you remember specifically how they attacked us? Do you know
they attacked the weak and the ill at the end
right,
of the
from behind, right?
Exactly. So we were, the way it's the Torah describes it, we were in the front was our, let's say, lead troops, whatever you want to call it, or right, but behind we had people that took longer to walk. And there's a whole discussion. What does that mean? We put people in the back, okay, but whatever. Bottom line is people in the back, and they really go. They're insidious. And the rabbis see Amalek as coming back every generation. There's a new Amalek. For example, some in the Jewish community called the Nazis Amalek. That's like a term, like in the Jewish community, we would say this rising group that hates our people and attacks us. We, especially in the most sinister way. Okay. Haman, according to rabbinic tradition, is a descendant of Amalek. So Amalek is one vision, saying, don't be naive. Amalek's always around the corner. On the other hand, Passover, he says the essential message is don't be brutal. You know what it's like to be a slave. You know what it's like to be oppressed. You can't do that to others. But on some level, here's what I found. My Siri's talking.
What?
Don't be brutal because you have an enemy that even if you have people around you that you feel threatened by, don't be brutal to them. The other response is, well, don't be naive to them. You can live. He doesn't say you should eliminate one. He says basically you need to live with both. We need to constantly live with these two senses at the same time. I'm going to give you an example of how I saw this very recently. I know many of you watched very carefully, like I did, on bated breath, that Shabbat, sadly, when the Rabbi Citron Walker was in Texas at a shul, where he was, and I don't know how he described what happened, if he got into the details, because I don't think every rabbi in America has been looking at this with like they study a piece of Talmud, because it was so unbelievable how he's a hero. Frankly, him and his colleagues. But what he did, if you remember, how did he let in the man who ended up being a terrorist? He perceived the man was homeless, which actually I think is true. I think it was something like he asked for food and drink. He gave him tea and welcomed him in. Now, he said he assessed, but he was busy leading services. It was live stream. It was a lot going on. But I could totally relate to this, sadly. I think it's most American rabbis, especially non-Orthodox, this is what we're doing today. So he let him in because he said, this is the mitzvah of don't be brutal. We know the heart of the stranger. And he did that. I'm so proud of him. I think we all should be. But he says when it came time for the Amidah, when he turns his back to the congregation towards Yerushalayim to lead towards Jerusalem, He heard the click of a gun. Don't be naive. You see how that moment defines the tension? Don't be brutal. Let in a homeless person. Don't be naive. This person could be a terrorist. I want to put out to you all. What do you think of Yossi Klein Levy's comments about this tension? Which one do you sympathize with more? By the way, within Passover and Purim, you could argue against them, so maybe you have a different opinion. And then we want to go further. What do you see as similarities from Purim and Passover in terms of the stories, based on what you know? And what are the differences that you know? Any thoughts about this idea? How you react to it? Differences, similarities? What do you say? Any thoughts? Is Ellen there? Ellen Bakasha.
I think there's a fine line between the two. I think Klein Halevi is right. You need both, but you can't go too far in either direction. You have to find that middle ground. I'm not saying it's easy, it's not.
Right.
But you got to find that middle ground and to help the oppressed, help those who need help with the awareness that, well, it may not be what they say they are. They may be something entirely different. But we can't shut our doors to everyone just because they may be. Because that's turning us into a fortress mentality, and that's a hell of a way to live. That's really bad. But you can't let everybody in either. It's that middle ground.
I think you said it very well. It's a tension. Yeah, Robin, you want to add to that, Robin?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Ellen shared, and I find it to be, I think my word is nuanced, because on the one hand, don't be brutal. Well, what was our mindset? What was happening to us at the time that took place? We might already have been on, soldier, right? High alert, just, hyper aware and feeling defensive and apprehensive. And then on the other hand, during, Haman, different, maybe a little more comfortable, a little more assimilated, a little bit more trusting, and maybe my guard was down. And so I see just a nuance there. I do see a little bit of a tension, but in both cases, I think one could say, don't be naive. For when we were being pursued by the Amalekites and they took advantage of weakness, right? And don't be brutal when it came to Haman, because we could have responded the way he wanted to. So I think it's nuance. Thanks.
And Robin, great point. And I want to just say, Robin's already bringing a very nice difference between the two stories. Again, we're just taking the stories as stories, but it's important. In the Pesach story, we are definitely other, right? We are the slaves. We are, quote unquote. In the Purim story, Esther is so assimilated that she fits right in. And the king doesn't even know. Again, I know it's a farce, but let's just take it on face value for a moment here. That's actually a difference in the two stories. Purim is about a time when the Jewish people is much more assimilated, or at least some of us are. And Pesach is a time when, although, by the way, who's the only one who's different than that? Is Moses. Mm-hmm. Moses slips in so it's not 100%, but I think Rob makes a nice point. She's showing a difference between the stories, but there's always a little counter example. But great point, Robin. You fit. Other thoughts about this, or even bleeding into what we think about the differences? Yeah. We give Steve Schechter. Steve, what do you say?
Well, I'm not sure the stories are that different. The story of Passover, there's no shortage of brutality. But later in the Torah, this message is taken from that story, that you should remember that you were strangers in Egypt and therefore treat strangers kindly. But I don't remember anywhere in the Purim story that any message of that ilk is derived from the story. At the end, Haman and many others who I don't remember are killed. And that's the end of the story as I remember it. So there's it's not that the stories are so different, it's just the messages taken from them are different.
Steve, I totally agree with you. Great point. Steve is basically saying, listen, let's look at the stories on face value, or straight up. They're both like, we get attacked and there's a response, and the response is violent. Pharaoh and the courtiers all and the people, they drown in the sea of reeds, the Yam Suf. It's not pretty. So, and then Haman and his sons, they all get hung on what do you call hang on a tree, whatever. Yeah, it's there is a brutality in the stories. But your point, but the way the rabbis interpret it, or even the Torah already start to tell us later already how, in a way. Now, again, Yossi Klein Levy's bringing a little bit. He's doing a sermonic move here, but I think Steve's point is well taken. Maybe the stories themselves aren't so different, but the way they're interpreted is different, and that's already shows maybe more similar than different. You fit. All right, Roberta, what do you say?
I was just thinking. I mean, we all agree that both of these points are important, and we should be not brutal, and we shouldn't be naive. I think my question is, how do we know the right time? It's like, I don't think we're always aware, or, you say don't be naive, but you might become complacent, and before you know it, you're in trouble. Or, in today's time, I think everything is so politically, and there's so much horrible discourse and everything, that we could maybe be brutal when we really shouldn't be brutal. So I'm just trying to say, how do we agree that we shouldn't be naive, and we agree that we shouldn't be brutal, but how do we stay on alert, or whatever it is, to know when is when? Does that make any sense?
Absolutely, Roberta. It's like brutality and naivete in some ways is in the eye of the beholder. Okay, that's one. I think also too, it's in hindsight, it's a lot easier to say how you should have done it. In the moment, like if Rabbi Sitchin Walker, to give an example, let's say he had a gun, would have any of us blamed him if he would have used it? On the other hand, is that really what was necessary to do? Who knows? I mean, it's like you're in crisis. So I think you're making a great point. The issue that Robert nuance, Ellen, instead of tension, you're saying of how do you know? I don't know. I mean, this is hard. I see Beth Ann's raising her hand. Beth Ann, Bakasha. Are you trying to unmute yourself? Oh, Beth, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So, I kind of see in both of the stories that, the central characters, as we understand them, Hadassah, Esther, themselves, Moshe's liar. But oh yes, there is something going on that someone should do something about. And then kind of the same thing, Esther, same thing happens with Esther, she sees that there's a threat, and she's terrified. I don't know what to do here. And so they both kind of embody that, like, I'm not naive to the threat, and I understand, and I that's really what I like about both these stories.
So, but then I just a little bit of your reception came in and out a little bit. Did other people have experience, or just me? Did anyone have? Okay. So I just want to say, I heard you say, I think I should say that Esther and Moses in some ways are similar, right? They both are people. I don't know if you said Moses or just the stories, but that Esther is afraid. She is not naive to the fact that she could get killed, but she decides to go forward and lead anyway. Is that what you were saying? Oh, I think Beth Ann's internet's not great. Am I right? Is everyone else? It's just me. Was just me? Did everyone else the same issue?
No, I saw it too.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Beth Ann. Maybe
We're not.
I think your internet's a little in and out. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Maybe you can move in your house or something.
I already did.
Okay, I'm sorry.
My internet is just, yeah.
Okay, maybe you could type it in the chat, or try again. Go ahead, try again. Try one more time.
Yeah. So both of the stories hold that very tension of, yes, there are people being oppressed. Yes, there is a threat. do we how do we respond to that threat? You know, I think both the stories themselves, the central characters, Moses, Esther, both are in the stories, they embody the, yes, there's this oppression. How do we respond to it? I don't necessarily want to be the one, but I may have to be the one.
Yes.
And I think that they both, like the stories themselves, that, you know, for all the similarities and all the differences, I think the central characters themselves are important embodiments of this tension that Yossi Klein Halevi is talking about.
That's awesome. And I want to just say, this is really profound point. Thank you for pushing through the internet issues. That's awesome. Okay. Think about it. Esther becomes the queen, we'll call it, and then she's really ambivalent about whether she should do anything. Okay. And she's really assimilated, as Robin said. Then she decides to come out and do it against, she risks her life to go basically say she's a Jew. Okay. Moses also is resistant. Remember, he gets called, he's like, who am I? I'm chopped liver, don't call me. Then he says, okay, so he's resistant. Then he does it, but he's also like, who am I? Now, interestingly though, like when Moses, you know, it's just, there's nuances of difference, but there's also similarities. Great point there, Beth. I think it's really simple to say the leaders. Now, I want to throw another point, by the way. In Pesach's story, it's Pharaoh who's the bad guy, and you might say the government, the head honcho. In Purim, the bad guy is a bad advisor who influences an idiot. Like, right? I mean, it's a little different because the king actually can be changed. Pharaoh, even the plagues don't change Pharaoh. We can get the whole thing with the hardened heart, but you know what I'm saying? Like, Pharaoh is ultimately in charge and Pharaoh's on a mission. Okay. The other one, it's a bad advisor. And I think both of these anti-Semitic experiences our people has had, where the leader is bad, an anti-Semite, or there's an advisor that's an anti-Semite. Like, they're both bad, but there's a difference in how you deal with that problem. Because the head honcho is one problem, a bad advisor is another problem. By the way, they're both problems. It's just that they're different types of problems. Okay. Okay. Does Ellen have no one? Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing that I remembered and I just verified it. Purim is also a little bit brutal because if you get to the last chapter, the Jews kill 75,000 people, yes, but they didn't plunder. It's like, really? 75 plus Haman's 10 sons and Haman, and there was another 300. So it was over 75,000 people that the Jews killed. It's a little bit brutal. It's a terrible ending.
Terrible ending. It's the kind we don't go with religious school and go to detail in preschool. Yes, you're correct. And it is brutal. And that's like, I mean, that's the perfect example of sadly, the dynamic of the difference on some level. Now, look, Pharaoh and the courtiers, they all end up sinking in the water, but in the sea. But the difference, right, is that it appears in the Torah. Again, you could say it's my read, but there's a resistance. There's a lot of opportunity for the Egyptians to turn away and Pharaoh to let go. And it's Pharaoh who decides. Now, his heart gets hardened and it's a whole theological problem, but still in the end, he's choosing to keep going every time. Whereas Haman's basically, there's no like last second reprieve for Haman. It's like, you know, you're gone. So this is a tension amongst our people, and you might say any people's oppressed. When you finally get the power to do something about it, do you just say like, oh my God, that's it. It's time to give it back because I'm angry, revenge, which I'm not condoning, but you can understand the feeling of wanting to feel free, as opposed to Pesach, where we technically kind of want just to get out of there, like leave us alone, is a more of the leaning towards in general. Okay. Any other thoughts of the Purim and Pesach connections or differences for getting into a little more detail about the stories? All right, let's get into some of the stories here. I'm going to skip. I give a lot more. If you're looking at the text itself, you'll have more to learn on your own. I'm just for the sake of time. I only have about 10-15 minutes max. I'm going to go right to some of the cool parts that I want to go to. All right, let's go to page. If you look on your own, go to page 3. We're going to go to Esther. The book of Esther, chapter 4, this last section. All right, verse 12. You see verse 12 here on the page, guys? Okay. So remember the story. Mordecai knows it's going to happen. I'm going to fast forward this way. He hears through guards, he's the whole thing. He overhears that the Haman is something. He says to his relative, is it niece, is it cousin, daughter, a lot of different midrashim. Fine. He says, Esther, you got to take care of us. Esther's like, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure, right? And then verse 12, this is where it all like comes. Mordecai, in a sense, kind of threatens Esther. Look what he says. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this. So Esther says basically, I can't go to the king and tell him just by going to the king, just by going unannounced, what's going to happen? Right? You don't go to the king unannounced. So he says, I'm scared, basically. I'm not sure I'll do it. Esther's words come back to Mordecai. He sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will rise from another place. By the way, place with a capital P. We'll talk about that. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So what's Mordecai, put in your own word, what's Mordecai basically say to Esther? Like, Esther, hey, save our people. She says, I don't know. I don't want to die. I don't want to do it. What's his response to her basically? In your own words? What's he say? What's his strategy to convince her to act? It's really twofold. He says, listen, do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. Meaning,
Your self-interest.
Esther, you think you're going to sit there? I'm going to give a really remarkable, to take Steve's point, really remarkable thing. You think you're going to serve as Hitler's butler and you'll escape this somehow? Hitler's going to get you too. It's coming. He knows you're Jewish, or he'll eventually find out. And you can't escape this just because you're so close to power or scared, by the way. You are part of this people. You can't detach yourself from injustice. You can't stand idly by. Not just because it's morally wrong, but because it's going to come to you eventually.
Okay.
You catch that? Any thoughts about that? Like in society, some people think, well, I've heard this many times, they're attacking this minority group. At least they're not attacking my minority.
Right. It came for them.
You know I disagree with it, but I'm sure we've heard this, right? Oh, they're attacking immigrants. Well, I'm not an immigrant right now. Okay. Therefore, by the way, this is totally against what I believe. I'm saying, but it exists out there. And this basically Mordecai saying, no, Esther. No, don't fall in that trap. It's coming free. It starts somewhere else. It's coming to you next. You're online. Thoughts about that? I assume people agree with this. No? Don't disagree.
No, wasn't it the thing where they said, they came for so-and-so, we did nothing, they came for so-and-so, and then there was no one to fight for us when whatever that.
So that's perfectly said. Due to Talmud, we'll get to the point. Say, yeah, that's basically from a Purim story is that doesn't fly, Esther. You're not going to get escape from this, even if you somehow sneak past it. And then, second of all, I'm asking you to stand up as a Jew, even if you are the most, to Robin's point, the most assimilated Jewish woman in the history of Jewish people. This is a moment to stand up. This is not the moment to be quiet. I don't care if you keep every mitzvah. I don't care if you keep Shabbos. I don't care if you don't keep kosher anymore. I don't care. This is the time that your people needs you. So step up. Okay. The second thing here is in the story of Passover, God is front and center. God tells Moses left, right, and indifferent. In Purim, God never appears in the entire story, except for this verse, 14. If you remain silent this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. And the rabbis say when place, which is in Hebrew makom, it's the only time, just by implication, God will save us. Pesach, God's delivering. Purim, God is way in the background. By the way, this is very aware of injustice issues today. There are those people, and by the way, I would put someone like Dr. Martin Luther King in this category, who believe very strongly that God, faith, is a very critical piece publicly and clearly, explicitly, towards fighting injustice. We're going to ask for God to help us in that journey. I assume no one disagrees with that. Never knows Dr. King was very, as a preacher, okay? But then you have other justice movements that say God's irrelevant, maybe, or certainly should be quiet. Instead, because if we put too much on God, and for those of us who took my last class on Hartman know this issue, then that can sometimes lead people to think they shouldn't do as much. Well, God will take care of it in an exaggerated way. I mean, I'm making a little bit of a over the top. It's hyperbole, but too much God takes care of it, and the people sit back. In fact, one of the criticisms of the Pesach story, some have said, is it's too much on God, and then we finally get free, and we start fetching because we're like, oh, why doesn't God give us more food? Because it's so God provides everything. It's like the Purim story is a little the opposite. Mordechai doesn't say, Esther, turn to God and pray. He basically says, Esther, tell the king right now, right? Now, again, it's a little more nuanced because what does Esther do next? She actually calls on the people to pray and to fast. So it's not that God's irrelevant. It's not, but it's a much more muted God. Anyone have thoughts about that in terms of injustice? Do we reach out to God to help? Do we reach the people to help? We do both. Thoughts?
No, but I just thought when God helps with Pharaoh, I'm thinking the Jews are like babies. They're just barely born. And they need their father or their mother to take care of them and guide them completely and do everything. At some point, a good parent learns to allow their children to falter and find their way and have to make decisions and stuff like that. So I sort of feel like this is over history, this is sort of how it evolved.
We're at a great point, by the way, and I've made that sermon too. That's a great sermon Rabbi Blumberg's bringing. Is basically, look, it's also a stage of Jewish peoplehood history. Shushan was a different time than it was in much later than Pesach. And being in a slave mentality in particular, we could be like babies. It's a great point. And I think there's Robin's point. It speaks to two different times of society. For my first, at the beginning, in Pesach story, we really are this oppressed subset of society that does not feel included. We are unassimilated. In Purim, we're really assimilated. Like Shushan, at the end of the story of Pesach, where do we end up? In the desert, away from Egypt. Where do we end up at the end of Shushan, end of the Purim story? Still in Shushan. We don't leave Shushan. We live happily ever after in Shushan. It's like saying we experienced, again, this hyperbole, the Holocaust, sadly, Shoah, but then some of us returned back to Germany, which probably some did. Some, and we know there's a small group, but it was complicated, but it went back. That's two different experiences, to go back to a place where you were oppressed once because you feel like that's your home, versus another time where you basically say, I'm out of here. I'm done. Even if I survived, I'm out of here. But this is very powerful, I know, and I'm saying this now in honor of Black History Month. Right? There are in African American or in Black American cultural history, and I say this person's not a scholar. I know there was a movement at one point that said, one says, let's say the Martin Luther King version says, we deserve our rights and America is our country. But there was a movement, we know, to leave America. I think that was the country, it was Liberia, that said, we're going to go back to a country that is our organic roots because this country is rotten to its core, essentially. It will not work. Pesach message you could say is, we don't want to be in Egypt anymore. It will not work. We're leaving. Purim story is, no, we can still hang in there. It was just a bad moment, okay, or bad Those are two legitimate ways to deal with injustice. Do we fight it to the end to try to create a society, or do we abandon it? There is a time for both. You can understand both of those choices. In fact, I would say some people would say, right, that I'm going to move to Israel if America keeps going this way, or Canada. Okay, I'm leaving this country because I feel like I can't change the injustice. It's so rooted, it's so rotten to the core, or dangerous. And then there are those that say, no, I'm going to hang in there and try to change it because I think that I have hope. They live in tension with each other too. Thoughts about that, Robin?
Yeah, I think I'm glad that you brought out a little bit more focus on what Mordecai communicated to Esther, because what occurs to me is whether the Purim story or Pesach or current events, we cannot escape that we are who we are, whether it's as a result of a forced requirement to maybe change and not, be Shomer Shabbat and be as observant or as forward with it. But I think it's important here that Esther might not have realized what Mordecai was saying until she responded very Jewishly. She went straight back to her cultural roots, right? When she really did not know what to do, she went to what was ingrained in her, something that was probably even involuntary. It was just what she knew she had to do. She wanted to pray. She wanted to fast. She knew she needed her community to do that. And the same thing happened even when we were at the foot of the mountain. At some point, we knew organically as a community that we needed to turn from one behavior and do something different. So whether it was, brutal or naive, at some point we go back to being who we are, and who we are requires some level of action. So I understand a little bit differently, Mordecai saying, don't think that if you don't do anything that you're going to be safe, because even if Haman did not out Esther, whether she thought about it or not, she would have outed herself anyway.
Robin, I think you're being Robin, you're making a kind of, and I actually, of course, I really resonate with it. I hope that we all would, but again, like in a moment of crisis, one would hope they go to the roots of your neshama. Like, what are your roots? Like, what do you believe in, right? This is your moment. And can you act courageously in that moment? Can you act with a sensitivity to your people, to your history? Can you do that? And, humans are humans, but in both the cases you gave in these stories, in that moment, even with the struggles, we made the decision to opt in, to take a risk, to risk our lives, even you could say, but to do that for the sake of something greater. I think it's very profound, but it's a choice. Obviously, it's a choice, and it's a choice that they made. All right, I'm sensitive to time. Unfortunately, I have to wrap up just a minute. I'm going to give you one last one to give it going to the very last text at the end. This is a famous midrash that shows the difference between Purim and Pesach. We go through the sea of reeds, my creations are drowning. Letter E on page 7. In the Pesach story, we go through the sea of reeds. Pharaoh says he's not going to come. He decides to come anyway. He brings his army. Boom, the water smashes down on him. They all drown. According to the Torah, at that moment, Miriam and some women, all people start singing and dancing and stuff like this. According to a midrash, the angels started to sing. It's not in the Torah, but the angels, to celebrate this. They Siman Tov and Mazel Tov. Look what this famous midrash says. The Egyptians are drowning in the sea. At the same time, the angels wanted to sing before God. And Adonai, God said to them, my creations are drowning and you are singing before me. You've heard this before, right? Some of you have heard this before, yeah? It's a famous, which is a lot of Haggadot on Pesach have it, basically saying that God is saying to the people, or angels, don't celebrate the death of even your enemies, because they're made in God's image too. He didn't say don't kill them, just said don't celebrate. This is the theme that Yossi Klein Levy is playing for at Pesach. It doesn't mean you shouldn't defend yourself. It just means don't be brutal about it, right? There's a difference between even defending yourself and being brutal about defending yourself. There's a difference. Purim's about, it's not saying you shouldn't be at least a little trusting, or, because remember, we stay in Shushan, so we think the society technically has potential. But don't be naive to the fact that there's a really bad root over there that you shouldn't address it. Okay. I feel bad, Lechaver. We have to wrap up here. You just got a taste of this. In sum, if I like, and I hope you'll resonate and struggle with this question about Purim versus Pesach, they both deal with genocidal attempts to destroy our people. There's definitely differences. And writ large, I would say the differences are, right? Yossi put beautifully. Purim says, don't be naive to that could happen anywhere, anytime, even the most assimilated society. Even Esther thinks she's the most connected. Anybody. So be aware, be on alert. It could arise. And Pesach says, yes, it could arise, but don't be brutal, even when you have to defend yourself. Keep your morals, hold the Torah. And then, as you all said in the beginning, is hold these in tension with each other. Hold these in tension. And when you go for it to Purim and Pesach, because Purim, we could have more examples of the brutality. And then other sides of Pesach, think about how we want to respond to injustice, not only against our own people, but against any people. Is don't be naive that it could occur, but also don't be brutal when you have a chance to do something about it. That's the tension between the two holidays. I see that Beth Ann I'll put one last comment, I'll give her the last word. I was thinking that Esther's story is kind of embodiment of Tikkun Olam. The notion that sometimes it is on us as humans to do it, do the thing, whatever it is, to bring about healing and justice in our corner of the world. God is there peripherally, but mostly our job. Exactly. There's another tension. Pesach, God seems to do a lot of the work with us, nudging us. Purim, it seems a lot's on us, and we kind of God's peripheral. Think about that too. Maybe it's a good discussion at your tables in these holidays. All right, guys, we have to wrap up. Yasher koach on great learning. Thank you to our guests that came from the Beth Meyer North. We're glad to have you as well, Mira and Devin. Beth Ann, great to see you as well. Welcome to our regulars. Josh too, welcome. And look forward to seeing you at our next holidays, next Purim, Shabbat, stuff like that. Stay tuned for more information. Okay, everyone? Have a great day, great Sunday, and a good week. Shalom.